Hello and welcome to India Today. When you get stuck in traffic jams in the cities of India, probably you must be wondering whether you can fly a car. And probably that's going to be a reality in India soon, as Union Aviation Minister Jyotiraditya Scindia recently said in a conference that flying cars would be a reality in India anytime soon. So to talk about this and many other things, today we have with us the Aviation Minister himself. Welcome, Mr. Scindia, to
Thank
India
you,
Today.
Kaushik. It's always a pleasure to be with you and with India Today.
So when are we getting the flying cars in India?
So, as I spoke yesterday in a conference in Bangalore, eVTOLs, which are electrical vertical takeoff and landing vehicles, something that we grew up seeing in movies and fiction like Star Wars and Blade Runner, are today on the cusp of reality. And there's a reason why I use those words, because there are thousands of engineers across the world who are working on making that into a reality. And the evolution from aircraft to helicopters and the evolution from helicopters to vertical takeoff aircraft and then to drones has, as a natural progression, led to the evolution and the reality of eVTOLs becoming a reality in our lives. So advanced air mobility is today an idea whose time has come. But having said that, I think there is still a lot of work to be done on an international basis. Regulation today is being harnessed across the globe, and the international bodies are working together to put together the regulatory process. Along with that, many prototypes have come to the fore. Those prototypes are today being tested both by the US authority, which is the FAA, as well as the European authority, which is EASA. So that's the second step, which is to validate the safety and the quality of this as a transport vehicle, both for passengers as well as for cargo. The third is this would certainly require a tremendous amount of infrastructure on the ground, which you and I are used to in terms of seeing either runways or helipads. But with advanced air mobility and eVTOLs, you will require vertiports, where these eVTOLs can land and take off in a very facile and easy manner. The fourth important point that needs to be made here as well is that we need to be able to have the charging facilities for these transport carriers, because as you're well aware, we're moving away from fuel-based carbon emission transport systems to electric, and eVTOLs are naturally going to be all electric, and therefore you'll have to have the whole infrastructure of charging systems being made. So I would say that we are probably internationally, as we as humans are pretty much on the runway as far as this is concerned. But these four steps need to be put in place, because any new paradigm shift that comes in, the first most important character has to be safety and security.
Modi government is known for setting deadlines. So have you set any deadline for this also, the flying cars in India, to ensure all the processes are in place?
Well, as I said to you, internationally first, I think the regulation has to come in place. There have to be models and prototypes that are approved, and then the rollout of that will certainly come. But if you ask me in terms of a timeline for this, I would say internationally we are looking at the next 18 months or so, 12 to 18 months. And I don't see why in the next 18 to 24 months, if that's the kind of timeline that we're looking at internationally, 18 to 24 months should also be the timeline for India. We've got a number of players that are interested in India. There have been some MOUs that were exchanged yesterday itself on the stage. There are companies that have already been in touch with each other, Skyblade with Eve, which is a subsidiary of Embraer, that are working on prototypes as well. So I think the process is on, but industry and government will have to work together to make it a reality. And I think both are working in right earnest.
Now, we may have to wait for flying cars, but you also said about the scarcity of aircrafts in India in terms of, if you compare it with the traffic volume. So we have recently seen some big deals happening, 400 aircrafts being bought by Tatas. How do you see this supply and demand gap bridging?
So it's a very strange situation, if you will. 2 years ago, we had 700 aircraft on the ground in India and internationally, thousands of aircrafts on the ground, and not a single passenger. And today, globally, you have soaring demand for aviation, and obviously the 2 or 3 large manufacturers of aircraft, whether they are Airbus or Boeing or Embraer, because of COVID and the cutback that obviously a lot of these companies had put in place in terms of the production cycle, and many supply chain issues, are not being able to supply planes with that rapidity. In India too, I think the very fact that if you look at our numbers, pre-COVID we were at a high of 420,000 passengers in a day, sometime in October 2019. And surprisingly, somewhat off-season, post-January, we have crested a new high in 75 years of India's independent history at 455,000 passengers in a day. The important thing also to note is that this is not a blip. On a sequential basis over the last 30 days, the variance has been between 390 to 430, 440 passengers, 440,000 passengers. And so therefore, this has become now what was earlier considered as highs by you and me, from the industry perspective, has now become the norm. And therefore, there is a greater desire to travel by air, which I think is a very healthy and a good thing. But it also augurs for a greater amount of aircraft to come into India. Now, there is, as I mentioned, a supply chain issue and a production issue by the majors. So therefore, to provide a stopgap solution to this issue between the order of supply coming through for India and the fleet expansion, from a regulatory standpoint, for wet leasing of aircraft, we had a limit of 3 plus 3 months, total of 6 months. We have increased that to 6 plus 6, 1 year, so that now airlines can wet lease aircraft and bring them in and use them for that period, which by when hopefully the supply will come in. I'm also very glad to note that in this aircraft order, 470 planes, which has been a historic high internationally. It's not a largest Indian deal, but it's the largest deal globally in the history of civil aviation. $70 billion for 250 aircraft with Airbus and 220 with Boeing. There is a healthy amount of wide-bodied aircraft that have been ordered, both the A350s as well as the 777s and the 787s. And that's something that I have been pushing for us to go ahead with, because I think there is a healthy amount of competition on the domestic market, maybe a little too much too, but that's always good for the consumer. But we need to go long haul. We need to be able to provide point-to-point travel capability for our passengers, and thereby try and create a hub, international hub within India, as opposed to today our hub being on either our western coast or our northeastern border. So I think that airlines such as Indigo, Air India, SpiceJet, also ordering wide-bodied aircraft will certainly aid India going that long-haul route to new shores and to higher skies.
Competition is stiff, as you said. Aviation industry is expanding, but still, of course, there was Ukraine war, there was COVID, but the losses incurred by the aviation industry, it has doubled in last few years. How are you going to balance that?
Well, let me say this, that it is not the job of government to look at P&L statements and balance sheets. As you are aware, this is a deregulated industry. It is something that you all have supported for the last 30 years. And I'm sure the last thing you'd like to see is the Civil Aviation Ministry again donning the cap of a regulator.
Not a regulator, but a facilitator.
Which it doffed. What we need to do is we need to make sure that there is two things. One, a level playing field, and two, make sure that there is an environment in which growth is spurred in the sector. And therefore, the first thing that I did on assuming charge is really take up the difficult thing. And the difficult thing we had been talking about for ages, that ATF must go under GST, because there are states that charge very, very high rates, and that's crippling for airlines. And think about it. You and I both have an economic background. The cost of ATF pre-COVID was 53,000 rupees a kiloliter. It went to a high of 140,000 rupees a kiloliter. It's today roughly around 108, 107,000 rupees a kiloliter. So the price of the commodity itself has doubled. And if you look at the fact that 40 to 45% of an airline's operating costs is dependent on one factor alone, and that's ATF. Just look at the crippling effect it will have on a company's P&L and then on its balance sheet. Add to that the fact that once you pay the ATF cost, then you have to pay a 27 to 30% VAT on that doubling of ATF. So what happens to your cost structure? So one of the things that I did was try and explain to states, plead with states, request states that we need to reduce the cost structure of ATF from a VAT perspective, as opposed to waiting for GST to happen whenever it does happen. And I must, through you, thank the chief ministers chief ministers and the lieutenant governors of 19 states and union territories. We had 12 states out of 36 states and UTs that charged 1 to 4% prior to July 2021. In the last 18 months, another 19 states out of a total of 36. So we had 24 states that charge between 20 to 30% VAT on ATF. Out of that basket of 24 states, 19 states have now moved from a regime of 24 to 30% to a 1 to 4% regime. And therefore today we have close to 19 plus 12, 31 states in the 1 to 4% regime, and only 5 states that are still outliers in that 25 to 30% regime. So through you, I'd like to thank the chief ministers and the LGs of those states that have moved to that 1 to 4% regime, and through you also urge the balance 5 states to certainly come and
which are those balance 5 states?
And follow the example of that others have set.
Which are those
what this
5
does
states?
to aviation in those states, and I'll come to that point in a second, is that two things happen. A, the urge to connect to those states becomes much larger from airline companies. B, the Laffer curve economic theory comes into place, where when you have very high tax rates, you will get less revenues. But when you lower tax rate, you get greater revenues. And therefore, let me give you the example of a state like J&K, one of the early states that, early UTs that moved from a high regime to a low regime. within 1 month of lowering VAT on ATF, their refueling in Srinagar jumped by 360%. And so therefore what they lost out on a high tax rate, they gained from a lower tax base and greater revenue, because planes would refuel there rather than in other states where VAT would be higher, because every airline company eventually is looking at its bottom line. And so therefore this was a very arduous process that we went through, very painstaking, but I must thank the state governments who have come forward and done this and provided that facilitatory environment for our airlines to grow.
But you didn't name those 5 states.
Delhi to start with, and then we have Tamil Nadu, Bihar, and we have 2 other states.
All non-BJP states, you mean to say?
I don't think it's a coincidence, but these are the states, that Delhi, Bihar, Tamil Nadu, and 2 other states.
Okay, I understand government doesn't regulate prices anymore, the fares. But still consumers are saying, consumers would not understand these nuances related to ATF and all that. But there is the common perception that, it's not perception, it's a reality that airfares are going upwards. And that's the common grudge of many travelers. Is the government doing anything to, not to regulate, but to balance out this high prices so that it becomes more affordable for many, because already the aviation industry is growing, but that comfort of price, a reasonable pricing is not there.
If you look at the industry per se, and I'm not talking about the industry per se within India, but if you look at the industry per se globally, this is an industry that is seasonal. So you will have high season and you will have low season. And it's generally the case that in festive season, which starts in October all the way up to Jan, or during summer when children have vacation and everyone wants to travel globally, the rates are much higher than in monsoon season, for example, or between April and May, for example. And so therefore those vicissitudes are a part of the cycle of the civil aviation industry. A. B, as I explained to you, when ATF prices have doubled and there are those pressures in terms of the losses that you're already talking about, therefore there are some economics that have to come into place. Your cost structure and your revenue structure have to balance out at some point of time. And thirdly, I'd also like to say that, as you're probably aware, Kaushik, that the industry goes through a system called RBDs, reservation bucket denominators, which means that if you or I book a ticket, let's say a month in advance or 20 days in advance, you'll 99% of the time find that it will be a very low rate. But if you and I go for a ticket for tomorrow, then obviously the rate is going to be much higher. And so a lot of these examples that do come to the fore are contributory to either one of these 3 factors that I've laid out to you.
Okay, while prices have gone up, there are examples, many incidents we have seen in recent times where the service of the airlines, it has dipped. Service, and we also see a lot of unruly passengers, incidents of one passenger peeing on another, and also the aircraft crew showing kind of insensitivity to the passengers with special needs. So these incidents, as you can read in newspapers regularly, is the government coming into any role play here?
We already have. This is not something that I think is something that we need to act on today. This is something that we need to act on every single day in the existence of the civil aviation sector in India. And with that in mind, we have civil aviation requirements, CARs, as you know, which are issued with regard to passengers, unruly behavior. We have cars that are issued with regard to how airlines are supposed to treat passengers. And if there is a violation of any of the above, then an inquiry is held. If it's an unruly passenger incident that's reported by an airline, then that airline itself has to set up, each airline has a quasi-judicial body with a retired judge or whatever that sets up an inquiry committee, and those inquiry committee findings are submitted to us as well. When we find that the airline is responsible, then we take action against the airlines. There have been many examples where airlines have been fined, for example. Example of is the analogy that you have given, where the airline itself has been also fined. Obviously, the issue between the passengers is not something that I need to comment on because it's sub judice in court. But certainly, the Civil Aviation Ministry is very, very active on this with respect to incidents happening on aircraft between passengers or with regard to service quality levels with regard to crew vis-a-vis passengers.
But why are these incidents happening? Do you see any pattern that these are growing in numbers, or it used to happen but now they get reported more?
Well, I don't think that there is if you'd like me to do a scatter diagram and plot a line through it, I don't think it's a ascending curve. These incidents have happened. They happen internationally. I mean, we've heard on American Airlines and other airlines where these incidents have happened. These incidents certainly should not happen. But we are, after all human beings, and we need to behave in a responsible manner. And if you behave in an irresponsible manner, then you must suffer the consequences.
Thank you, Mr. Scindia. I had many more questions on civil aviation, but as you are running out of time, I respect that. And thanks for joining India Today.